So as I've been thinking about what Advent might be for us this year, which ministers face this every year. We try to bring you stories that you may have already heard or that are traditionally part of the liturgy in new ways and fresh ways, and also things happen in the world that mix up in that and cause us to look at it in different ways. And so this year, as I sat with the results of our election, which have caused me a tremendous amount of grief and are getting ready to cause a lot of people a lot more grief, I was thinking about how to bring Advent to you in the midst of this. And the chorus that kept going around in my head, so many times God uses music. Bo knows that very intimately. Uses music to speak to us. And the chorus kept going around in my head. And it's one of our favorites here at UCH during Advent. Emmanuel, Emmanuel, his name is called Emmanuel, God with us, revealed in us. His name is called Emmanuel. And it just kept going around and around in my head, and it caused me to look more deeply at a couple of the words. The first one I want to lift up to you is Emmanuel, which only shows up in a couple of places in the scriptures, which means, and Matthew tells us this, God with us in the present moment, which makes it one of my very favorite names for God. There are hundreds of ways to look at who God is for us, but I love that name Emmanuel because it talks about how God comes to us in the present moment. Also, the word revealed jumped out at me in this because Advent has a revealing or a revelatory. The word in Greek is apocalypsis, apocalyptic, has an apocalyptic quality. As Edna Marie Brown says, things are being revealed in us. The veil is being pushed back, and I'm paraphrasing there. I don't know if I included that. Um, but 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 she said things that are hidden are being revealed in us. And so in Advent, there's an element of that, what is hidden being brought to light. And so I want us to pay attention to what is being revealed in us. And we're going to talk, as I said, Advent has an apocalyptic element. We're going to talk about John the Baptist next week and invoke that a little bit. But I wanted to begin this week, and I didn't have us look at the begats or the genealogy or the genesis of Jesus today just to trip Steve up. So, I want us to applaud the liturgist who reads through all of this for us because there are some tongue twisting names in here, some of which we have never heard of. But this is how Matthew chooses to begin his narrative. And as I said, the word translated genealogy here. Let's just look. The genealogy, an account of the genealogy of Jesus the Messiah, the son of David, son of Abraham. The word genealogy in Greek is Genesis. So this is like Matthew's Genesis, his beginning of the story of Jesus. And interestingly enough, Luke has a genealogy too. And in Luke's genealogy, he takes Jesus' lineage all the way back to Adam and to God, to the very beginning. But Matthew starts with Abraham. Let me let some folks in here. Okay, good. Um, Starts with Abraham. And I want you to keep in mind, I mean, some of, if, as you hear some of these names in the genealogy, you'll recognize them. Others you have never heard of, and that's totally okay because this is not history. As we've talked about so many times, there are historical things in it. There are, and that's really important, but it's not history. History is not so neat as to be laid out in 14 generation increments. There's a reason that Matthew does that. Um, but that we'll talk about in a minute. But I wanted to look at some of the names. I'm curious which ones you recognize when Steve read it and which ones you didn't. You probably recognize Abraham and Isaac, Jacob, the guy with the ladder, the angels, the ladder, who was manipulating his father-in-law and then wrestled with his wife and then wrestled in the riverbed. We've talked quite a bit about Jacob. Judah, you've probably not heard a lot about, who's the father of Perez and Zerah by Tamar. I want you to notice in this genealogy, there are some women that show up. And I think that's so interesting because this is not the traditional way patriarchal genealogies are done. But we have Tamar, who was a woman. Her story is fascinating and tragic, in that she was trapped in levirate marriage, and then Judah would not hand her off to his youngest son. She was married to his oldest, whose name was I believe. And then she was passed on to the next one, and then he died, and she was kind of caught in limbo because Judah would not pass her on to his youngest son. So she disguised herself as a prostitute, and after Judah's wife had died, and he employed her, and she became pregnant, and she became pregnant with Perez and Zerah, who are the ones mentioned here. So in this story, you have prostitution, you have incest, you have levirate marriage, multiple. There was also a brother who, the middle brother she was passed to, Onan, practiced what's called in Latin coitus interruptus, or he pulled out, and God got upset with him about that and killed him. Which is one reason I want to lift up that this genealogy is a container of stories. Do you do you have family stories? You have stories about things in your family, and sometimes the stories take on as much import as the facts or the history. So I want you to be aware of that in here. And also, when people in the present day get into lifting up biblical ideas of marriage being between one man and one woman, they're not looking at Genesis 38 for sure, because that's a big old honking mess. But it's a story. And the interesting thing is that Tamar emerges from this a heroine. And if you go on a little further in you have some names we've probably not heard of: Abinadab and Nashon and Salmon, who you may have heard of because he's the father of Boaz, who you may be aware of because Boaz was the partner of Ruth. And Ruth is the next woman that shows up in the genealogy. And she too, Ruth was a Moabite woman who had this beautiful relationship with Naomi. And Naomi coaches her about how to seduce Boaz on the threshing floor. We're going to talk about threshing floors next week when we talk about John the Baptist. But she seduces him, and there's an uncovering of feet that happens, which is not about shoes. That's about sex in the Hebrew Bible. And so Ruth also becomes a heroine in the story. Uh, but notice that Tamar is Canaanite, by the way, and Ruth is Moabite. So they're not Jewish women, but they become heroines in the story. I want you to notice that because this is setting up who Jesus will be in the world. Jesus is going to come for a diverse group of people. Everybody, basically. And not just ministering to a small group of people, but a diverse group. And so I want you to pay attention to that because God is a diverse God and a lover of diverse people. So we have Boaz and Ruth, then Jesse, who you may have heard of because Jesse is the father of King David. King David is important because there's the system of numerology. See, there weren't numbers in Hebrew, so they assigned numbers to particular letters. And this system of numerology is called gematria. And so if you do the gematria on David in Hebrew, it comes out to 14. And so that's what Matthew's got. David's important in this. So we want to Matthew's agenda is to show us that Jesus and King David are connected. So he's doing this in sets of 14 generations, and the numerology of David's name is also 14. So that's something you might not know if you didn't speak a little bit of Hebrew. So we have we have King David, Jesse, and then King David. And then we have, and I love the way they do this, and David was the father of Solomon by the wife of Uriah. The wife of Uriah, nameless here, is Bathsheba. I don't know what the deal is there if Matthew couldn't quite bring himself to say her name or what. But, we've talked many times about how David misused his power. His palace probably set up high on the hill here. We've talked in Bible study about where David's palace would have been. And he could see her bathing, and he was watching her, probably unbeknownst to her, watching her bathe. And then he ends up killing her husband and using his power to seduce her. Some of the language in there, feminists have suggested means rape. And so, you have him. Though she is the next woman that comes up, even though she's kind of unnamed here. But she is a heroine too because she perseveres, even though we don't know that much about her beyond this. Because she lost her first husband because of a power play that David made. And I want you to notice in Jesus' genealogy, there are all these, there's rape, murder, incest, coitus interruptus, levirate marriage. It's a complicated family tree. Do any of you have complicated family trees? I would say we all do if we look deep enough. So the next thing I want to point out about this is that there are several names here that we probably are not that familiar with. King Hezekiah is kind of important because he's the one he's the king the Deuteronomists love because he purges all of the Canaanite goddess symbols and Canaanite religious symbols out of the temple. Nehushtan, the brass serpent that was held up in the book of Numbers, to protect the people from the flying, stinging serpents, whatever they were. The words are hard to translate, so we don't know exactly. But Nehushtan was purged out of the temple by Hezekiah, as were the vine wrap posts called the Asherah, which were Asherah, Ashtaroth, associated with Canaanite goddess worship. So the Deuteronomists love Hezekiah. Um, and so then we go down, and I want you to notice the way that I ended this first reading, because it's really important to Matthew that we mark the deportation to Babylon. Now there were two exiles in the Old Testament. One was to Assyria, and the main one probably was to Babylon. And this was a really important, tragic, traumatic event that would have been in Jesus' ancestral memory and ancestral lines. And it's important that we notice it. It's important to Matthew. So after the deportation of Babylon, we have a whole list of people, some of which we've heard of, most of which we have not. And then we end up with our more familiar folks. Jacob, the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary, who bore Jesus, who's called the Messiah. So all the generations from Abraham to David are 14 generations. And from David to the deportation to Babylon, 14 generations, 14 generations, 14 generations. That's what I was talking about. So if evangelicals around you are telling you that numerology is of the devil, there's an awful lot of it in this piece of scripture. So I want to, all the 14s, there's a reason it's connected to King David. So, in this genealogy, you have all of these stories. And I think the stories are important. And so what we have here is the story, the genesis of stories, if you will, of Jesus' life. They tell us something about him. They also, I think, throughout these stories, there is a struggle to find the words. To find the words to talk about who Jesus is, a struggle to find the words to talk about who God is and how God is operative in the world. It doesn't mean that that's how God is operative in the world now. It means that is how these writers thought God was operative in the world. And so you end up with these stories like God killed somebody because of coitus interruptus, which is what happened to Onan. God does not operate that way in the present moment. Those are ways that that they were trying to make sense of who God was at that time. Just like we are trying to make sense of who God is in this moment. So that doesn't mean we have to pull all that forward, because we don't. So I just want to lift that up for your thinking this morning. So, how is God with us in this? How is Emmanuel present in this? I think the storytelling, this whole idea that these writers and Matthew are trying to and struggling to find the words to describe who God is and how God is working in the world. I mean, that's a beautiful struggle. That doesn't mean we have to buy into their words and adopt them and wear them around as our very own. But it does mean that they were trying to make sense of it. And that makes scripture powerful, I think, for us, and as a healthier way for us to look at it and think about it. They were struggling to find the words, trying to make sense of who God was and how God is at work in the world. So I want, as we wind up here and move into conversation about this, I want you to, I mean, so we have here, this is Jesus, the story, the genesis, the beginning, the lineage of who Jesus was. And I want you to think about your own lineages this morning and your own stories and what you resonate with in Jesus' story as we begin this Advent. I love Linda Hogan's uh Chickasaw elder Linda Hogan's little quote where she says, walking, I'm listening to a deeper way. Suddenly all of my ancestors are behind me. Be still, they say, watch and listen. You are the result of the love of thousands. Thousands. I would also add to that that we are the result of their drama and trauma as well as their love, and that all this kind of flows into who we are. So I think it's super important that we pay attention to that, because I think whatever is manifesting in our lives in the present moment is pointing to things in our ancestral lines that need healing. It's looking at parenting, for example. Maybe I don't like the way my parents did some things. They did their best, but maybe I don't like it. And so I decide that in this present moment, Emmanuel, God with us, I'm going to parent differently. I'm going to let my son and help my son process his emotions, and to learn to identify what he's feeling, and to learn to set boundaries. And maybe my parents weren't capable or didn't understand that that was a thing that they were supposed to be doing. And so I'm actually, when I do that, I'm healing my ancestral lines. And I'm saying, the buck stops here with me in this generation. And so the next generation is going to be different. And so I want you to think about that, because I think we are all being called to look at those points of healing and what's manifesting in our present moment. Our ancestors in our nation right now, we got all kinds of things that are manifesting that need healing. Our legacy of slavery, our legacy of misogyny and manifest destiny, and the genocide of Native American people. Yes, we've done good things in the world. We are a strong nation, but we have also done some very awful things that we have to look at. And so we have to bring those stories forward too. We have to talk about the way white privilege affects who we are. We have to talk about misogyny, heterosexism, and homophobia, about the terrible hatred that has been heaped upon the trans community because of political agendas and just general misunderstanding and awfulness. We have to look at those things. That I talked a couple weeks ago about diabolos being at work in the world, about those voices of untruth. We have to be discerning about that, and we have to be discerning about where they are in our stories and where they are showing up for healing in the present day. That is how God is with us. Emmanuel. Those are the only slightly hidden things that are being revealed. Apocalypsis revealed in us. And yeah, it feels apocalyptic. It feels big, because it is, and it's important. I want to end with a word from Nassim Khan, who's a British activist, who writes, as we navigate the complexities of our lives, we often find ourselves bound by the legacies of those who came before us. Their joys, their sorrows, their beliefs and experiences ripple through our existence, shaping our perceptions, choices, and outlooks. Yet within this inheritance lies both the brilliance and the shadows, gifts of resilience and knowledge alongside patterns of trauma and limitations. This is what we are working to heal in ourselves. And this is what Jesus, the Christ, the Messiah, coming into the world, dragging this whole story behind him, is inviting us into. So, questions for reflection as we move into this. How is your story shaping who you are this morning? What are you being called to heal in your ancestral line? How has your lineage shaped who you are? How does knowing more about Jesus' lineage shape our experience of Advent? What does it mean to be a good ancestor? How do you want to be remembered by the generations that come after you? Let's talk about these things now. Amen.